Get onto Facebook. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Before we start, I'd like everybody to raise a glass and toast both Susan and Maggie Hope, who's taking her final bow this evening.
Cheers. Thank you.
And John Charles of our staff is going to be, because he's way more organized and thoughtful and so forth than I am, he is going to be, well, it's true. He's going to be leading part of the discussion, and then we'll swap. So, and I'll hold up the dog. So anyway, that's what we're doing. So thank you very much for coming. Over to you, John.
Hello and welcome both to our virtual audience and those attending here tonight. The Poison Pen is delighted to have back with us one of our favorite authors, Susan Elia, did I get that right? MacNeal, whose latest book is The Last Hope. For those tuning in virtually, we will have signed copies, so if you'd like a copy, now's the time. As soon as the program is over, go online or give us a call. We'll connect you with this book. Now please join me in welcoming Susan.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, everybody at home. It's so great to be here. And I don't know, somebody left the oven on apparently because it's pretty hot. But
I think everyone's mourning in their own way the last adventure for Maggie. But
yeah.
Before we get into that, I'm always fascinated because Maggie has a backstory, but you have a backstory. Who was Susan before you discovered Maggie?
Oh, well, my whole background is in publishing, but on the other side of the desk, not as a writer. I was an editor. I started off as an intern at Random House, and then I became an editorial assistant at Viking Penguin, and became an associate editor for Dance Magazine. And when Dance Magazine moved to the West Coast and I lost my job, I decided to go freelance. So in a evening of endings and beginnings, an ending led to Maggie, and I'm hoping the ending of Maggie is the beginning of many other things. So,
What prompted you to pick Maggie as your protagonist?
well, that's a whole story that involves the Jim Henson Company and the Muppets. Yeah, it's true. It's true. My husband is a puppeteer, and he does work for Jim Henson Company and Sesame Street and the Muppets. And he did this show called Bear in the Big Blue House on Disney Channel, and he played Bear. And Bear was really big in the UK. And we got to go after I lost my job. I was able to go for like 6-8 weeks with him to London because unemployed. And it was visiting the Churchill war rooms, really, that led to Maggie and the whole creation of this universe. I had never been there, and I didn't even know they existed. A friend of ours who's British, we all went out to a pub, and he brought this Time Out London, and he said, you really need to go to this museum because despite what you Americans think, World War II did not start with Pearl Harbor. And I took it as a challenge, and I went to the war rooms, and that was before, like now they're big. They're big and fancy, and there's all these different things. But back then they were just like this little sort of undiscovered thing. And has anyone been to the war rooms in London? Yeah. Okay. So for those who don't know, it's this underground bunker where Churchill and his colleagues all basically ran World War II, especially during the bombings. There's this huge slab of protective concrete over it so that they wouldn't all get taken. They could meet, but not get all taken out at once. And I just thought, you're walking the actual halls, you're seeing the actual signage, you're seeing the maps of Europe with the push pins exactly where they were when everybody left on the last day. It's this incredibly transportive experience. And Maggie, when I saw the little room for the typists with the little mirror so they could adjust their hats and put on their lipstick, that's when I thought of Maggie.
And she's an American, so how did she get to London? during World War II.
Well, she's American and British, and she inherited a house. So it was her grandmother's house, and she also had a friend from college, from Wellesley, who was also living there, and she was working for Joseph Kennedy, who was then the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the U.K. So she had sort of an inroad, and she had some friends, and she was really just going to kind of come and go, but then, as they say, things happen.
What can you tell us about the new book, The Last Hope?
Well, the new book, The Last Hope, is full circle in that Maggie Hope starts out as Winston Churchill's secretary and catching an assassin. And now she, so many, adventures later, is an assassin or has been asked to be an assassin. So it's kind of a double-pronged mission. It's to meet with Coco Chanel, who she met in one of the previous books, who is a very questionable figure, doing some spy work for the Nazis. And this is all based on fact. And she was also asked to assassinate Heisenberg, who was in charge of the German nuclear program. And this is also based on a true story, the story of Mo Berg, the Red Sox shortstop who was tasked by the SIS, who was that's the precursor to the CIA, to assassinate him if he thought that their weapons program was close. So just all these stories kind of combining and braiding together is the novel.
You mentioned Coco Chanel, and she's a fascinating person because she did so much for fashion, but she was not a good person.
She was not a good person. I do appreciate what she did for fashion. Women before Coco Chanel wore these incredibly huge and heavy hats. They wore corsets. They were hobbled by these huge skirts. And although she would never call herself a feminist, she really got women to the point where, we all could move and have much more active lives. And I appreciate that. But she was also incredibly anti-Semitic. She did sleep with a Nazi intelligence agent. She did missions for the Nazis. She was what they called a horizontal collaborator. And yes. And she used Aryan laws that the Germans brought in when they occupied France to try to get control of her company back from a Jewish family who bought it. So the thing is, even among her peers, she was especially anti-Semitic, which I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of Coco. And I don't know if anybody's seen The New Look. That's the show on Apple. Yeah, I think that's a very sympathetic portrait of Coco Chanel. I think she's maybe it's Juliette Binoche plays Coco Chanel. And I just felt like she came off as much more likable than, well, she does in my book, let's just say. So
You've written about Maggie for, is it 10 books now?
11 books.
11 books. What, if anything, has surprised you about her over the series?
I think what's been surprising is that when I first started out, I really didn't want to have a James Bond type character where every book it was reset. And so Maggie's really carried her trauma with her. And she wouldn't have called it this then, but, she has PTSD. And that's been really interesting to write. It's been very difficult to write because she has been through so much.
When you started out and as you were writing the books, as an author, how much do you plan in advance for the series? Because characters come and go, things happen to them, and you have each book contained, but there's an overarching kind of storyline to it.
Yes, there is. I have had an idea for an overarching storyline, and I have had ideas for individual books. So, to try to work all that in together,
Any surprises along the way?
I think, a lot of people were surprised that Maggie didn't just end up with John straight away. I think that's what I get from a lot of people, and I just thought she's so young, and this is such a crazy time. Like, why would she settle down with the first guy who asks her, basically? Oh, and I said, and no spoilers, but I mean, it's a very hopeful ending, but there is no wedding. And I said that I just don't think like the be all and end all and culmination of a woman's life should be a wedding. And then when I was talking in New York, I had to say to my husband, "No offense, sweetie," but but no, really, I didn't want that to be defining her. So
You also brought Maggie back to America for a couple adventures,
yes, indeed.
including one in California that surprised me because I didn't realize it was a hotbed of Nazis.
Not a lot of people know about that part of American history, and quite frankly, it's deliberate. It's been glossed over. But yes, in a lot of places in the U.S., in the 30s, there were a lot of pro-Nazi groups, the German-American Bund, some of the Italian-American groups, a lot of people, just regular Americans, like entranced with fascism and power and things of that nature. It was also seen as an alternative back then to communism, which was really considered to be anathema and dangerous. So yes, fascism flourished in the 1930s, and it wasn't until Pearl Harbor really that everything sort of went underground.
And then you kind of spun that off into a standalone book.
I did. I wrote a standalone called Mother, Daughter, Traitor, Spy, and it's set in Los Angeles. And I just, doing research for the Hollywood Spy, I encountered these two women, a mother and daughter team, who became spies for this like spy organization that didn't even officially exist. It only existed because this amazing man with foresight, Leon Lewis, went to the FBI with all of his concerns about the growing Nazi power and was basically told, like, we only have budget for fighting communists. So he put together his own spy ring and ran them and did an incredible job, and was only given like even the slightest amount of credit after Pearl Harbor. But I just thought this mother and this daughter, real life, who went to work for him, was so fascinating, and I couldn't get it out of my head, and so I wrote about it.
Well, we're all glad you did. Now my question just flew right out of my head. Let's see. Oh, your writing process, because it differs for each author. You write suspense, mysteries, crime fiction. Do you always know how it's going to turn out, or do you just hope it comes together?
I always start with an outline, and I don't always follow the outline, but I do always start with an outline and a sort of basic idea of what's going to happen, and then other things happen. I've actually gotten better, I think, about planning and plotting twists out, just because there are certain, effects I want to have on the reader, like the gasp, the jaw drop. I always like it. My husband is always my first reader, and I always like it. He'll like knock on the door of where I'm working. He's like, oh, I can't believe you did that. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. That's that's really great feedback for me. So that's what I'm trying for.
You got your start in the other side of publishing and in editing. Does that make it easier for you as an author, or is it more challenging? Do you want to think that you've got a leg up?
Well, you kind of know in some ways how the sausage is made, if you get my drift. But no, publishing is always changing. It's always evolving. We've been through so many changes, even in the past decade plus that I've been an author. It's just never the same, even 6 months ahead.
So you don't get in fights with your editor and say, I know best?
I've been blessed with some very, very good editors, and I respect them a great deal. So
you were kind of at the forefront of World War II popularity with readers. Why do you think that time period resonates so much?
You know, it's so funny you say that because when I first was pitching Mr. Churchill's secretary, basically nobody wanted it. No agents wanted it. No publishers wanted it. And I was told that women only wanted books, historical mysteries set in Tudor and Elizabethan era, Victorian times, or Regency times. And they did not want 20th century. They did not want World War II. I think Jacqueline Winspear and Maisie Dobbs had a lot to do with opening up the 20th century for women writers and for women mysteries. And I think Downton Abbey certainly helped because people were saying like, "Oh, did you plan that?" I was like, if I could plan something like that, like.
Are we allowed to ask if there's something coming from you as a writer?
Yes, I'm so excited. So I have a new contract with Minotaur, which is an imprint of Macmillan, and I have a 2-book contract with them. And so the first is for a standalone. And okay, this is my elevator pitch. It is James Bond meets the Golden Girls in 1966 swinging London. Okay, so that is the standalone. And then they are interested in a new series. And I have pitched that as Sherlock Holmes meets an Italian-American Mrs. Maisel in late 1950s New York City. Wow. So. Oh, with the mafia.
Of course,
Of
because
course.
it's Italy. What kind of path did you take as a reader? You write historical mysteries. Do you enjoy reading them?
I do enjoy reading them, but I read everything, like everything. I read every genre, like literary, sure, nonfiction, but also like horror, fantasy, thrillers, noir, you name it. Basically, if I get a good recommendation from someone, I'll give it a try.
Okay, these are 2 kind of more esoteric questions, but what was John Irving like?
John Irving was really great. He was a professional writer, and I learned so much from him because he basically got up early, went to his office in his mansion, and started writing. And he wrote all day, every day. And it really made me realize that working authors were not waiting around for any sort of muse. They were not day drinking. They were not, doing anything crazy. They were sitting at their desks and they were working. And I think that was just such a great lesson.
And you worked as an assistant to him?
I did. I picked up his laundry. I house sat for him. I did everything.
And the other is, where did the book of drinks come from that you created?
After going to London, like my husband and I really liked going to cocktail bars, and we really got into things. And then I started doing infused liqueurs because sometimes you can't find exactly what you want. So I was making up all these recipes, and I thought I would pitch a book about it. The thing is though, the real story is that just as I got the book contract, I became pregnant. So I didn't have any fun like doing this cocktails book. My husband and his friends had a lot of fun because they were my tasters, but I was not having anything.
You've been writing for a while. We won't say how long, but
It's okay.
you've seen things change in publishing. If you were in charge, how would you make publishing better?
I would take some of the money that goes to the very, very, very top, not even 1%, but like the 0.05% of authors, and I would spread that around to the mid-list and I don't even the debut authors. There's so much where it doesn't necessarily need to be, and there's so little where it could be used so well.
It's tough if you're a mid-list author because the money goes to the big names, or you get a chance as a debut, and if you don't make it, you're gone.
Yeah, but basically, John, it's a gamble. Publishers are gamblers at heart. They might as well be running casinos in Las Vegas. It's really true. Honestly.
Yeah.
It is.
I mean,
true.
it's the Game of Thrones going on at the moment because of post-COVID and a whole lot of things happening. So, I don't think that we can reform it. The good news is there's lots of small and independent presses coming up that I think will help balance things out for sure.
Yeah, I don't think that's like a grand solution. That's just like my wish list.
I know.
If I
It
were,
sounds ideal, but the truth is it
Yeah.
just doesn't work out that
No,
way.
no.
I know. Right. Yep.
What advice would you give yourself if you had to go back and start writing all over again?
Oh, I would give myself the advice to take more breaks, don't burn out, don't read reviews. Yeah, I don't know. To enjoy the enjoyable parts much more and like worry less about the things you can't control, because there's so much you can't control, but you can control what goes on the page, and it's good to remember that.
Gonna take her.
All right.
Oh, thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Jen.
I just have to say thank you to John, because he's
Of
been
course you do.
such an early supporter of the book and been a constant supporter of the book, and is such a just an incredibly wonderful human being. And so
Oh,
thank you
thank you,
very
Susan.
much,
He
John.
is indeed an ornament of the bookstore. I'm so glad you mentioned one-star reviews, because I was just at a conference in London with 100 authors, and my favorite panel was John Connolly, who was very funny, and Mark Billingham. And their panel was they read their one-star reviews. And
You know,
I'm
at a certain
telling
point,
you,
yeah.
it was absolutely a riot. And I thought, I'm going to work that out one of these days. We're going to have a panel, and the authors are going to come in, and they're going to bring their one-star reviews and comment. It
At
was
this
hilarious.
point, I would love it.
It really was.
When I
one of
first
the-
started, I would not have loved that.
No, you would not have. And you know, the thing about historical fiction, going back to this, when I opened the store in 1989, how long ago, the 1920s barely qualified as historical fiction. And it was very hard. Carrie Greenwood, for example, writing, you know, the Miss Fisher, nobody cared. And then last year, Laurie King wrote a book called Back to the Garden, and it's set in 1973. And I realized to my shock that the line had moved forward in that time. And so basically historical fiction's like 50 years. So I was depressed to think that, you know, I was out of college and, you know, whatever it is. But the 20s are now in the distant past.
Yes.
Comparatively speaking, than, you know, when 35 years ago. And therefore the 20th century is now considered historical fiction. And it really wasn't. It was more the 19th century when we started
When
out.
we started, yeah. My son, who's 19, sometimes asks us about, you know, like the 90s, and like in the late 20th century. Right. And then I'm like, oh my God.
It's a horrible thought. So I read a book last week, and I'm going to talk to the author. I have to set it up at the end of July. And it's called The Crown Jewels. But the whole point of it really is, you will love this, is that Churchill decided, because Churchill had arranged for the British gold supply to be taken by submarine across and taken to a bank in Montreal and kept in the basement during the war to keep it safe. So the premise of this book is, now it's the Crown Jewels' turn, right? That's going to be the whole sort of thriller thing. But this guy, it's one of the most uneven books I've ever read. It goes, have you read it?
No, I have not.
Okay, well, anyway, the part that I've been thinking about sitting here is his description of Churchill's. Churchill, you know, came from a very wealthy family. He had a tailor that made him blue velvet boiler suits that he could step into and zip up. And that's what he wore most of the time. But for formal occasions, he had a pinstripe boiler suit. I thought, I just love that whole idea.
They
that
have one in the war rooms.
Yeah.
Like they have one on display, one of his
Right.
velvet boiler suits.
Right.
And his staff used to call them his rompers.
They did.
They did.
Absolutely. But, you know, he could get in and out of them in a hurry. He also had a distressing tendency to meet with his staff naked, and he took hot baths all the time. And I was once at a golf resort in below Turnberry in Scotland. I can't think of it. And they had a Churchill suite, and the bathtub was the size of a small whale. But he did a lot of his work, didn't he?
He did. And he expected his secretaries to like be right outside the
Exactly.
door taking down his.
So I've had this whole new vision of Maggie as Mr. Churchill's secretary confronting this guy in a blue velvet boiler suit. And the other thing he did is he wouldn't go when the Blitz started. The bombs would come down at night. Instead of wearing his tin helmet, I love the fact they had a tin helmet, like that was really going to work, you know. He would go up on the roof and he would watch what he called the Great Show.
Yeah.
He really felt immortal, didn't he? Or it was his mission to get through the war.
I think he just wanted to be part of
Yeah,
everything.
maybe.
And he didn't want to hide away. He knew other people in the UK were enduring all
True.
this. And I think there was part of him that wanted to bear witness. I don't know, though.
Well, it was a lot of things. He was
Yeah.
very Victorian, despite the fact
Yes.
this was 1940. He came
He
from that whole
was.
Victorian tradition.
But even within his peers, and I didn't understand this when I first started researching him, but even within his peers, he was considered old-fashioned and very Victorian and completely out of step on certain issues, including what was going on in India. So, yeah, he was complicated.
He was really, in many ways, an unlikely choice. But without him, I don't think that England could have survived. It's just his will alone, pretty much, let them hold out. So he's a remarkably interesting character.
Yeah.
And I love the way that you have shown him in here. I also agree with you that Coco Chanel was not an admirable person, but her whole mantra was she was a survivor. She had a terrible childhood,
Yeah.
and bad things had happened to her. And I think that she was willing to do anything to survive. That was really, if she had an ethical code, it was basically, I will survive.
She was all for Coco Chanel.
She was. And in the conversation you were having with John, I think it's important to realize that there were a lot of fascists in Britain. There were many people who were actually Nazi sympathizers.
Yeah, that's another
And-
thing that gets covered up. Yeah.
Well, again, this interesting book that I still haven't
Yeah.
quite made up my mind what, but he actually had a list of some of the prominent lords and so forth who were known Nazi sympathizers. The one that really upset me was the Marquis of Wellington, whose father, I think, would have turned over, many times in his tomb had he realized that. But there were a number of, you would know that Lord Redesdale, the father of the Mitford sisters, obviously was going to be controversial that way. But it's kind of hard for us to realize that, and part of your book, in fact, dwells upon that fact that,
Yeah, and a lot in the upper class. And that's why Coco Chanel was actually codenamed Westminster. And that was
Right.
after one of her former lovers, the Duke of Westminster, who was friends with Winston Churchill and was part of that incredibly anti-Semitic, pro-fascist world before the war
Very
started.
frightened of communism. I think we have to remember that the Russians in their brutal revolution, which wiped out their king, their royal family and the whole bit, was not very distant from
No,
them.
and there were a lot of people in London who were witnesses to,
Right.
who were white Russians and who were witnesses to everything
Right,
that
so
happened.
they were far more afraid of communism than they were of Hitler and fascism. But I like the fact that you take Maggie to Spain and Portugal.
Thank you.
Which I think, is an important. There haven't been that many people who've actually looked at the role of, particularly Portugal. We know a lot more about Spain because of the Spanish Civil War, where the fascists and the communists were duking it out. But I don't think we realize that Portugal, in its neutral status, was a place for spies to congregate.
Huge place for spies. And in fact, a lot of the James Bond casino, and somebody remind me which book movie that is, the one with the
Casino Royale,
Oh,
I think.
oh, thank you. Oh,
Yeah, I know. I know. Sorry.
I'm jet lagged. What can I say? Is based on the casino in Lisbon, in Portugal. So, that all goes back to World War II spy games in Portugal.
Absolutely. You take her to, I've been to all those places, Estoril and Sintra and the whole bit, and I can see them. There are still some beautiful palaces out there. It's
wonderful.
gorgeous. It's west of Lisbon, so it's on the kind of the turn. You go down the river Tagus and then on the Atlantic kind of part of Portugal. But Robert Wilson, years ago, and I wish I could remember the name, Lisbon was in the title, wrote an absolutely brilliant espionage novel about what was going on. But I thought the scene in your book where Maggie is so... Small Death in Lisbon. Thank you very much, Patrick. I love it when he pops out. I loved it when Maggie arrives in Lisbon and people are out in the streets partying. They're going about their lives. They're having drinks, and there are no bombs falling and nobody is,
There are
starving.
electric lights everywhere.
That's right.
Coming from London.
I thought that was such a wonderful scene and such a counterpoint to what you have had to write about London and occupied Paris for that matter. So, have you spent any time in Portugal?
I have not been to Portugal. I did go to Madrid to research this book, but I did not get to Portugal, and I hope to go someday.
I hope you do too. It's one of my very
Love
favorite
it.
places. But anyway, and there's a real echo there because, in point of fact, the war against Napoleon that culminated at Waterloo, much of it was fought in Portugal. That's where Wellington came from India and became a general from whatever he had been, and really Napoleon really basically lost that whole war in Portugal. Much more so, it was just Waterloo was just like a mop-up. Although actually he could have won it, and then it would have gone on forever. But I love that. Right. So I see that the puppy is totally bored by this whole thing. He's gone to sleep. Right.
So cute.
Right. So when I was in Jackson a few weeks ago, my husband and I one night were looking around for something to do because we were exhausted from running around in the Tetons. And on the screen was a choice about The Catcher Was a Spy. So I had read Susan's book so long back that I'd totally forgotten that she dedicated it to Mo Berg, the catcher. And so I'm watching the movie and I'm thinking, this story is so familiar. So I wrote to Susan about it, who then kindly and gently reminded me that, in fact, her book was dedicated to Mo Berg and that there was a real plot to assassinate Heisenberg, who was the leading German physicist.
Yes.
Actually, the world's leading, maybe he's the world's leading physicist.
Well,
of them.
he liked to think of himself
he
as the
did.
world's leading
Right.
physicist.
And there was, as you know, the Manhattan Project, there was a whole group in America working on the bomb. And there had been a raid in Norway to shut down the Germans' access to heavy water, which was a death blow, really, for their nuclear plan. And I think it was it you or was it in the movie, because now I can't really quite distinguish them, that said that the Nazis had decided, or Hitler, they'd made a choice, instead of spending more money on their nuclear program, that they were going to throw it all into the rockets. And
Yeah,
that was
the
going to be
V2
their last,
bombs.
that was going to be their
That was going to
last
be the
hurrah.
hurrah. That's just sort of fact. But when you
Yeah, but I don't know if I read it in your book.
oh
or
well,
saw
I
it in
don't.
the movie.
It could have been either. I don't really remember the movie that well. But I definitely remember using that. And Maggie. For those who followed Maggie's story, her aunt who raised her was a professor, and academia is brutal. Like, we talk about publishing being brutal. Academia is just as, if not more, brutal.
Because the stakes are, I'm trying to remember how that goes. The fighting is so high because the stakes are so low.
Yeah, right.
Right.
But the way that Heisenberg, for me, and this did not happen in the movie, but for me, I thought Heisenberg's tell would be his bitterness that he just couldn't contain when he said something about the V2 bombs and how they got the funding. And Maggie, as a professor's adopted daughter, would absolutely pick up on that. Absolutely, that he did not get the funding, and be able to press him on that. So that, that was how I did it.
Yeah, no, it was extremely well done. But there's so many things about the war that we know. One of the things that you mentioned earlier. How many of you know that we never declared war on Germany until Germany declared war on us? Pearl Harbor. We all think, okay, that was it. We declared war on Japan, then we declared war on Germany. Not at all. Hitler. We might very well have gone for a considerably longer time without fighting the war in Europe if Hitler had not made what is now thought of as a strategic error, not quite of the magnitude of going to war with Russia, but close, to declare war on America, which then made it easy for Roosevelt to finally unleash everything. So I think most Americans today don't recognize that. Right.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, anything else you'd like to say about the book?
About the book. It was funny when I was talking about the book recently. somebody asked me, well, why did you end it the way you did? And I said, I realized that a tragedy would end with a death and a comedy would end with a wedding. And so in this book, without any spoilers, we have a small death and we have the possibility of a wedding. So we've covered everything and left it open. And I cringe a little bit saying this, but I think it's a hopeful ending. So,
Well,
yeah.
and since today is June 6th, I think also we
Yes.
should remember that tick-tocking in this book is the move towards D-Day. It hasn't actually happened, but you can see that we know, they don't know, but we know that it's coming. So I'm really pleased that, although I honestly didn't give it any thought at the time we scheduled this, but I
Yeah.
could take credit and say, yay, we've decided to do this as a D-Day celebration, but I have to be honest, I didn't. But I thought how appropriate when I was thinking about it today that we're going to be talking about this book
Yeah.
on a day when we have to remember that all of the things that you talk about in your books and all the effort and the sacrifices and the bravery and all the rest of it,
And when there is such a rise in right-wing
fascism all over again.
and it's again an issue, which is
As is anti-Semitism.
yes.
Both factors that have come back into play. So I was always grateful that I was born in 1940 because I'm really too young to much remember the war, and I missed the 1930s. I did not expect when I got to my 80s that I would be back in the 1930s, but that's sort of where we are. The echoes of it are, but, history is like that, isn't it? It's very cyclical in a way.
But I will say, for me, one of the huge lessons of World War II is that so many civilians, just regular people like Maggie, like her friends, these weren't people who were trained as in the military. They didn't go to military school. They weren't trained as soldiers. They felt called and they did what they felt they needed to do. And they came together in that way. And I think there's an incredible lesson for all of us in that. So we do live in what Churchill would have called stern times. He never liked to be too negative, but I think that's the lesson: is that we all have a certain responsibility to do what we need to do.
I hope that will be true. The other thing I think one of the huge differences between then and now is that people really stuck to the Official Secrets Act. They took it really seriously. They weren't rushing to post everything as I was just doing on Instagram. I was watching myself talking to Jackie Winsberg Tuesday night because it's interesting that this week both of you have been here talking about the last Maisie Thompson, the last Maggie Hope. And Jackie had written this terrific, beautiful letter that she had sent out to booksellers, and I wanted her to read it. So while she's talking, I have my phone because my phone, keeps turning off, and I look like this really rude idiot, sitting up here with Jackie talking. I'm scrolling away on my phone. I thought, God, I hope people are, like I'm watching, scrolling through Instagram or something on my phone. I was just trying to keep the letter up on the screen so I could hand it to Jackie so she could read it. But I thought many people might have thought that was just sort of normal behavior. Everything has changed so much with the advent of social media and phones. And I wonder if something like D-Day could even happen today. How could we even keep it secret when war is constantly on television right in front of us? Think about the Ukrainians who are enduring a blitz of their very own.
Indeed.
But it's not remote from us. So, I maybe that's part of the reason that World War II is of continuing interest.
Yes.
Right. How about questions from any of you? Surely you have some, since this is, the last Maggie Hope.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you write as a child or a teenager or when you were in college?
I did, but I never took it very seriously. I mean, writers were like those other people. They were the special people. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like normal people. Working in publishing actually helped me sort of change my mind about
Demystify
that.
it?
Yeah, I was demystified. Like suddenly I was talking to authors all the time and they were all quite interesting in their own ways, let's just say. Oh, hi.
research something in whatever genre or whatever, there's this temptation to put everything that you just learned.
Oh yeah.
As you know, exposition for 5 pages about the history of Wales or whatever. What did you really wish that, from your research, what do you wish that you could have found a way to include of like, there's this really fascinating thing, but it never really kind of came up in.
Oh, you know what? With this book, so Kim Philby, and yes, that Kim Philby of the Cambridge Five, was in charge of SOE's Iberian Peninsula intelligence, so Spain and Portugal, and it's Kim Philby. And, I had to be like, nobody knew who he was. So I had to be pretty discreet about, what he was showing. But boy, I wished I had been able to go into it because it's Kim Philby.
Well, you do just slightly hint. Maggie makes some effort to say to Churchill, maybe you should take another look at Kim Philby. And Churchill just can't believe.
Well,
Cannot believe.
Philby had the right accent. He had gone to the right schools. He looked
He
the
was one
part.
of us,
He was
is-
one of us, the old boy network. So, yeah, no one really suspected.
No, it's true. Yep. Are you going to move around there, little guy? Did you have a question?
Yes.
Rumor, not rumor, but on your social media, it was, did we ever land the TV series with the BBC?
Oh.
Whole Maggie Hope?
No. However, it's still with Warner Brothers. So it basically was optioned by Daisy Ridley and Blue Sky Pictures in the UK. And basically nothing happened, and it all just did not happen. And then out of the blue, I got an offer from Warner Brothers, and they still have it. And things have been kind of crazy with COVID, and there've been a lot of changes in personnel, and the person who's sort of making the effort wants to sort of wait on certain people getting out of jobs and coming into jobs. So I wouldn't say it's dead in the water, but I'm not counting on anything. So I kind of try to keep to what I can control, which is like what I write and my next book project. And I sort of just let all that kind of happen in the background because I can't do anything about it.
COVID really derailed, and then the writer's
Yeah.
strike. It was like a double whammy. First we had COVID, and then we had the writer's
it's all
strike.
a house
and
of cards too. But I mean that was a bummer, but we all move on. So
I'm not familiar with Kim Philby. Could you fill me in?
oh yes, so Kim Philby was one of a group of men called the Cambridge Five, and they were they'd been converted by the Russians to be spies for the Soviet Union. So he was even during World War II, before the Cold War, he was a Russian spy. So we have Maggie working for him, and of course, Russia and the U.S. and the U.K. are all on the same side at that moment. But the Cold War is looming, and it's just a really sort of dicey, interesting proposition. And I didn't even mean for Kim Philby to be in this book. It was when I found out he was heading the Portuguese Spain, intelligence, that I just couldn't not put him in, So yeah, so that's Kim Philby. And boy, you have some great reading ahead of you if you so choose about him, because
not just him, but all 5 of them.
Yeah,
They
the
were-
rest
they
of
were
them.
at Cambridge in the 1930s is when all that happened. Cambridge is usually considered, if I use an American word, more of an egghead university, whereas Oxford is more of an establishment university. I spent a summer at Oxford, and the library, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, because I am a librarian, so that was one of the things I was interested in. You have to take an oath in order to get your student ticket to go to the Bodleian, that you will not light fire. Remember, you've probably done that, Karen. So the whole thing is wonderful. But anyway, they use a system. They may have changed it since. I hope so, because this was a long time ago. And they cataloged all their acquisitions by the date that the book entered the library. And they had these enormous ledgers, and they had little pots of paste and little slips. And I'm serious. Anyway, it was almost impossible to retrieve a book from the Bodleian Library if you were a student, and so everybody went to Cambridge. It's not that far, and you would request your books from the Cambridge Library, which was in the egghead tradition, up to speed and could supply your books. And that was just, I thought that just so beautifully summed up the difference between the two universities. So it would have been more likely that the communist thing would take hold among the student body at Cambridge, who considered themselves more intellectuals and more whatever it all is. Yeah, like Berkeley, exactly. Yeah, very true. Although today I observed that my own alma mater, Stanford, the protesters locked themselves in the president's office and, were to get arrested. And that's the first thing I said to Rob. I said, wait, it's not Berkeley, it's Stanford. What happened here? I
So
know,
funny.
it's amazing. So yeah, what didn't Philby? Which one of them wasn't it? Philby that went on to become the Queen's curator of pictures.
No, that was
Which one was it?
Anthony Blunt.
Oh, it was
Yes,
Anthony
thank you.
Blunt.
And if
Thank
you
you.
see if you've seen The Crown,
Right.
that's a big part in one of the I don't remember which season, but he had a very big role in The
Yeah.
Crown.
So I mean, they had surprisingly hefty roles and positions, and I did think that you captured that very well. Because it's almost I think it's your book, isn't it? The last sentence. I'm sorry, there's so many things in my head, but isn't it almost the last sentence of your book when Churchill says, but he's one of us.
Yeah.
He's
It's
just
towards the end, yeah.
Yep, just can't imagine that Philby could possibly have gone over to the other side, and yet Churchill knew that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were, way over in the Nazi camp and all. So he shouldn't have been surprised, if you really think about it, that maybe fascism was more akin to what Churchill's whole ethos was than communism, which he just couldn't imagine. Maybe that was it.
Maybe that is it.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yes.
What kind of research did you do in Madrid? And I just thought, Spain is such an interesting place, during the Civil War when you talked about, regular people. They have such a huge, their literary greats were all part of the war and that figures in.
Well, yeah. So I was so privileged to be able to go to Spain. I went to Madrid, and it was amazing. So I went to, so there were hotels and restaurants where people from the Allied nations would go, and then sort of across a park would be the hotels and restaurants where the people from the Axis, would
Which one
go.
was the Ritz? Which one?
That's Axis.
It was,
yeah.
wasn't it?
Yeah. And the Palacio was the Allies.
I didn't stay at the Ritz when I was in Madrid. It was incredibly expensive and very old, but you could see the sense of history. It's not like the Ritz in London at all. Did you go in?
Of course. I mean, there were scenes there, and
We had coffee.
Yeah, I had tea, and I think at the other one I had a cocktail.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. No, it's Spain has a fascinating history during the 20th century as well.
Absolutely.
So, books to write. So now that does historical fiction, is that really your passion?
I do love it. I really do love it. I love uncovering things about history that have been sort of buried and lost and forgotten, and that's a real passion of mine.
Yeah, I asked
So-
Jackie the same question
Yeah.
on Tuesday, because she's going to not be writing Maisie Dobbs,
Right.
but something else. And she, too, feels that she's really an historian by inclination and avocation.
Yeah. I don't know. The modern world I don't know. It's too,
I often
it's
wonder
too in your
what
face.
people will write about our times.
Yeah.
I'd like to live long enough to, I don't know how long I'll go, but I'd really be probably fascinated and totally horrified by what people will. I will say this, that having just been abroad, other nations are looking at us as in absolute disbelief. They absolutely cannot even imagine what's going on here in this country right now. I felt like posing as a Canadian, I really did. So you couldn't make up the stuff that's happening.
Oh,
Thriller
absolutely.
writers we have these conversations often, that
I'm
if you
sure.
were a contemporary thriller writer, I noticed, that Daniel Silva threw in the towel, and he's writing a British mystery essentially in July. It's called Death in Cornwall, and it's Gabriel Alon, but he is in fact chasing art rather than spying, because I mean, part of it is if you're trying to write to the cutting edge of what's happening in a contemporary thriller, you could turn in the book and it would all be gone, out of date or
Absolutely.
whatever it is by the time
Absolutely.
you did it. So I
Absolutely.
think history is a wonderful place to go. Right. Anybody else? No, we've stunned you with our right. Well, in that case, thank you all very much for coming this evening.
Thank you
a
so
virtual
much.
audience. Thank you, Susan,
Thank you.
for coming
thank
back.
you, Barbara.
Oh, there you are. That woke you up. Right. Oh, that's all right, baby. We scared you. I would like to thank Susan. Is it you that is responsible for these beautiful
Yes,
flowers?
I wanted to say thank you to you and John and everyone at the Pen, because you guys have been a champion of Maggie Hope and of my books, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Well, you're welcome. But I want to make a pitch, too, for your Not Maggie Hope book, which
Oh.
I thought was fascinating. And I can recommend another book called December 41, which has got much of similar information. I didn't know there was an actual Nazi bunker in Los Angeles. I mean, I had no idea that it was really that,
Yeah.
pronounced. I'm from the Midwest, and so there was conversation about interning Germans, because
Yeah.
Wisconsin and Missouri had enormous German populations. And so we never went that route like we did with the Japanese. But, there was some nervousness I can remember about. But I didn't realize that they actually had a plan for the West Coast. I'm trying to think what they called the bunker, the Fuhrer bunker, right, on the West
Yeah,
Coast.
it was where he would meet with people from Japan. Like that
Yeah.
would be his
So if you're interested in this and and I really recommend that book by Susan a lot.
mother, daughter, traitor,
Yeah,
spy.
great book. Then December 41 is a book well worth reading, and it involves basically a Nazi spy who's in California and travels across the country on a mission to assassinate Roosevelt and Churchill, who are meeting in Washington.
Yes.
So, that one thing too, because there's a lot even though there's a lot we know, there are gaps in the information. So you can imagine things happening like around a meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, because we don't have actual minutes of the day by day whatever. And so there's a lot of room for historical fiction, I think, to work in that. Yep. All right. So Susan will be very happy to sign your book. And if she stays up here, I'll move the flowers so you can have a particularly beautiful photo opportunity, right? So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Barbara.